Part 1. Introduction. In the stillness of midnight, on December 2nd, 1984, a silent killer swept through the city of Bhopal in central India. It came not with the roar of warplanes or the crack of gunfire, but as an invisible cloud, drifting low through the streets, carrying death with every breath. The Bhopal gas tragedy, often called the world's worst industrial disaster, claimed thousands of lives in a matter of hours. And yet, decades later, its shadow still lingers, etched into the land, the air, and the memories of survivors. This is the story of how negligence, corporate greed, and broken systems collided to unleash one of the deadliest man-made catastrophes in history. Part 2. The background. To understand Bhopal, we must first understand the promise and peril of industrialization in the late 20th century. During the 1960s and 70s, India was undergoing rapid economic development. The government encouraged foreign companies to invest, to create jobs, and to bring new technologies. Among these companies was Union Carbide Corporation, an American multinational chemical giant. Union Carbide built a pesticide plant in Bhopal in 1969. Its subsidiary, Union Carbide India Limited (UCL), was meant to produce pesticides to support India's agricultural revolution. Farmers were told this technology would help fight hunger and increase yields. At the heart of this production was a highly toxic chemical, methyl isocyanate, or MIC, stored in massive underground tanks. MIC was volatile, flammable, and deadly when inhaled. It required meticulous safety standards and constant monitoring. But over the years, financial pressures mounted. The pesticide business was not as profitable as expected. Cost-cutting became the norm. Safety systems, once considered essential, were neglected or abandoned altogether. The plant's workforce shrank, training declined, and maintenance was postponed. The stage was set for disaster. Part 3. The night of the disaster. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, Bhopal was settling into a quiet sleep. Families tucked their children into bed. Workers ended their shifts. Street vendors closed their stalls. But inside the Union Carbide plant, a deadly chain of events was beginning. A large quantity of water somehow entered a storage tank containing over 40 tons of MIC. The water triggered a violent chemical reaction, releasing heat and pressure. The tank's temperature skyrocketed. The safety systems designed to control such a crisis, refrigeration units, scrubbers, flare towers, had either been turned off, were malfunctioning, or were inadequate. At around 12:30 a.m., the tank burst open, releasing a thick, poisonous cloud of MIC and other gases into the air. The invisible cloud crept across the sleeping city, carried by the cool night breeze. People woke up choking, gasping for air, eyes burning as though seared by acid. Many tried to run, but their lungs filled with fluid, and they collapsed in the streets. Mothers clutched children who had already stopped breathing. Entire families suffocated in their homes. The city of Bhopal had become a gas chamber. Part 4. The human suffering. The first hours after the leak were chaos beyond imagination. Within minutes, the streets of Bhopal were filled with panicked people. Entire neighborhoods were running blindly into the night, coughing, vomiting, and collapsing. The gas attacked the body in cruel ways. It burned the eyes, making them water and swell until vision blurred. It scorched the throat and lungs, leaving victims unable to breathe. For many, every gasp felt like inhaling fire. Mothers carried infants who had already stopped breathing. Children screamed for help until their voices were stolen by the poison. Hospitals in Bhopal were overwhelmed almost instantly. Doctors had no idea what they were dealing with. Patients poured in by the thousands, their eyes red, their lungs drowning in fluid. There were no warnings, no antidotes prepared, and little guidance from Union Carbide about what chemicals had been released. Doctors tried everything, from oxygen to injections, but for most, there was little they could do. The morgues could not handle the dead. Bodies were laid out in endless rows, lined along streets, stacked in trucks, and buried in mass graves. The smell of burning pyres and rotting flesh filled the air. Some families lost multiple members in a single night: parents, children, grandparents. Entire lineages erased in hours. By the morning of December 3rd, the scale of the tragedy was undeniable. Official estimates claimed around 3,000 people died that night, but survivors and activists argued that the number was much higher. Tens of thousands more were left severely injured. And yet, the true horror was not just the deaths of one night, but the suffering that would last for generations. Survivors reported lingering blindness, chronic breathing problems, organ damage, and reproductive disorders. Children born after the disaster often carried the scars of their parents' exposure, birth defects, developmental issues, and genetic disorders. Even the land and water of Bhopal were poisoned. Toxic waste seeped into the soil and groundwater, ensuring that long after the gas cloud had dispersed, the disaster continued silently, every single day, through contaminated drinking water and poisoned crops. The tragedy of Bhopal was not a single night. It was an unfolding nightmare, one that continues to this very day. Part 5. The immediate aftermath. When dawn broke on December 3, 1984, the city of Bhopal looked like a battlefield without bombs. Streets were scattered with shoes, bicycles, and fallen bodies. Survivors wandered aimlessly, eyes red and swollen, coughing violently, searching desperately for lost relatives. It was as though an invisible war had been fought in the night, leaving behind only silence, confusion, and death. Hospitals and medical chaos. As morning came, Bhopal's hospitals were still overflowing. Thousands of people, many barely able to stand, crowded into corridors, waiting for help. Doctors were forced to treat patients on the floor, in stairwells, even outside in the open. Medical staff, unprepared and uninformed, struggled to understand what they were fighting against. Union Carbide had not given Indian authorities or doctors any emergency plan, nor did it provide information on the chemicals involved. Doctors did not know whether to treat patients with antibiotics, oxygen, or steroids. They did not know if they should flush eyes with water, give antidotes, or use ventilators. Some patients survived because of quick improvisation, but many more perished simply because there was no clear medical guidance. For families, the nightmare was compounded by uncertainty. Relatives searched hospital wards, morgues, and city streets, often identifying loved ones only by their clothing, as faces were swollen beyond recognition. Government response. The Indian government initially appeared paralyzed. Officials were slow to react, partly because the scale of the disaster was beyond imagination, and partly because Union Carbide, an American multinational, was politically and economically powerful. But within 24 hours, the truth could not be hidden. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi ordered immediate investigations. The government promised compensation, free medical care, and justice. Military units were sent in to help with relief operations, cremations, and mass burials. Yet for the ordinary citizens of Bhopal, these promises felt hollow. They had lost too much too quickly. Union Carbide's reaction. Union Carbide's headquarters in the United States released statements downplaying the scale of the tragedy. The company's chairman, Warren Anderson, flew to India a few days after the disaster, but instead of offering solutions, he was quickly arrested by Indian authorities, only to be released on bail within hours. He returned to the U.S. and never came back to face trial. Union Carbide officials argued that sabotage might have caused the leak, attempting to shift responsibility away from the company's negligence. Survivors and activists rejected this narrative, pointing to years of safety lapses, cost-cutting, and ignored warnings from engineers and workers. The world reacts. International media quickly descended on Bhopal. Graphic images of mass burials, grieving families, and hospitals overflowing with patients spread across newspapers and television screens worldwide. The disaster shocked the globe, sparking debates about industrial safety, corporate responsibility, and the vulnerability of developing nations hosting multinational industries. Charities, NGOs, and human rights organizations rushed to provide aid, but the aid was small compared to the scale of destruction. Most survivors had to rely on neighbors, local volunteers, and their own resilience. First steps toward justice. In the weeks following the disaster, survivors began to organize. Community leaders, lawyers, and activists demanded accountability from Union Carbide. They called for medical assistance, proper compensation, and environmental cleanup. For the first time, the voices of ordinary people, many of them poor workers and slum residents, rose up against one of the world's largest corporations. But the road to justice would be long, painful, and filled with betrayal. The Bhopal disaster was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a legal, political, and moral battlefield. Part 6. The Legal Battles. The gas cloud that swept over Bhopal on December 3, 1984, killed thousands in hours and left hundreds of thousands injured. But what followed in the courts and halls of power would stretch on for decades. If the night of the disaster revealed the human cost of negligence, the years afterward revealed the failures of justice. The first lawsuits. In the immediate aftermath, survivors, activists, and human rights organizations demanded accountability. Families who had lost loved ones needed compensation for burial costs, for medical expenses, and for the lives that could never be replaced. Workers demanded answers. Doctors demanded resources. The Indian government, under immense pressure, began preparing legal action against Union Carbide. But the question was, where should justice be sought? Union Carbide was an American company, headquartered in Connecticut. Its subsidiary in India, Union Carbide India Limited, UCL, was technically responsible for operating the plant. Should victims sue in India, where the disaster occurred, or in the United States, where the parent company had its headquarters? American courts initially appeared to be a possibility, since the parent company was there. Survivors and lawyers hoped that U.S. courts might deliver higher compensation. But in 1986, the U.S. courts ruled that the case should be heard in India, claiming that India was the more appropriate forum. Many later saw this as the first major blow to survivors' hopes. The Indian government steps in. The Indian government passed a law in 1985 known as the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act, giving itself the sole power to represent all victims in legal matters. This meant that individual survivors could no longer directly sue Union Carbide. The government argued this was necessary to avoid chaos from thousands of separate lawsuits. But critics claimed it silenced the very people who had suffered most. Thus, the struggle for justice became a battle between the government of India and Union Carbide Corporation. The settlement of 1989. After years of negotiations and legal wrangling, in February 1989, the Indian Supreme Court announced a shocking settlement. Union Carbide would pay $470 million as full and final compensation for the disaster. The settlement was controversial from the very beginning. To Union Carbide, the agreement was a way to close the chapter. The company admitted no wrongdoing and considered the matter resolved. To the Indian government, it was presented as a victory. At least some money had been secured for victims. But to survivors and activists, it felt like betrayal. Estimates suggested that between 15,000 to 25,000 people had died as a result of the disaster, and more than 500,000 were affected in some way. Divided among so many victims, the settlement amounted to only a few $100s per person, barely enough to cover basic medical care, let alone a lifetime of suffering. Worse still, the settlement also meant that Union Carbide was shielded from future civil claims in India. For many, this was not justice. It was an escape route for the corporation. The extradition of Warren Anderson. One of the most bitter symbols of injustice was the case of Warren Anderson, the chairman of Union Carbide at the time of the disaster. Anderson had flown to India just days after the leak, only to be arrested briefly and then released on bail. He immediately left India and never returned. Indian courts later declared him a fugitive. Repeated extradition requests were made to the United States, demanding that he face trial in India. But these requests were consistently denied. Anderson lived out the rest of his life in the U.S., passing away in 2014, without ever standing before an Indian court, without ever answering to the families of Bhopal. For survivors, this was not just a legal failure, but a moral wound. To them, it showed that powerful men could walk away from the world's worst industrial disaster without consequence. Criminal trials in India. While Union Carbide Corporation escaped serious criminal accountability, some Indian executives of Union Carbide India Limited were put on trial. In 2010, nearly 26 years after the disaster, an Indian court convicted 7 former UCL employees of negligence. Each was sentenced to 2 years in prison and fined around $2,000. For victims who had waited decades, this verdict was seen as an insult. How could such a massive crime, one that killed tens of thousands, be punished with what many considered the equivalent of a traffic violation? The anger in Bhopal boiled over, with protests and demonstrations demanding stronger accountability. The fight for environmental justice. Even as legal battles continued, another war was being fought over the poisoned land of Bhopal. After the disaster, the plant site was abandoned. Toxic chemicals, including mica and other hazardous waste, remained stored in corroding containers and leaking pits. Over the years, these poisons seeped into the soil and groundwater. Local communities, already scarred by the gas leak, now faced contaminated drinking water and poisoned crops. Survivors groups demanded that Union Carbide, and later its new owner, Dow Chemical, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, be forced to clean up the site. But Dow Chemical insisted it bore no legal responsibility, since the disaster happened before its takeover. This argument was rejected by activists, but accepted by many courts. The toxic legacy of Bhopal thus remained, not just in people's bodies, but in the very ground they lived on. A symbol of global injustice. Over the decades, the Bhopal disaster became more than a local tragedy. It became a global symbol of corporate impunity. It raised haunting questions. Should multinational corporations be held accountable in the countries where they operate? Can governments truly represent their people when negotiating with powerful companies? And most painfully, can justice ever be measured in money when lives have been destroyed forever? For many survivors, the answer was clear. Justice had been delayed, denied, and diluted. The world's worst industrial disaster had become one of the world's greatest legal failures. Part 7. The Long-Term Legacy. The gas cloud of December 1984 dissipated within hours, but its shadow has lingered over Bhopal for generations. Unlike natural disasters, which eventually fade into memory, the Bhopal tragedy continues to unfold silently, through the bodies of survivors, through poisoned soil and water, and through the children born long after that night. Health effects across generations. The survivors of the disaster carried deep and lasting scars. In the weeks after the gas leak, many experienced chronic breathing difficulties, loss of vision, neurological disorders, and organ damage. But as months turned into years, it became clear that the disaster was not confined to a single night. Respiratory illnesses became common, with many unable to walk long distances or perform daily work without gasping for air. Women reported menstrual disorders, miscarriages, and infertility at alarming rates. Survivors complained of persistent headaches, fatigue, and a weakening of the immune system. Perhaps most devastating were the children. Babies born in the years after the disaster often suffered from congenital disabilities, twisted limbs, weakened muscles, cleft palates, brain damage, and developmental delays. Entire generations were shaped by a poison their parents had inhaled years earlier. Doctors in Bhopal began to speak of an epidemic of suffering. They described how survivors aged prematurely, as if their bodies had been pushed decades ahead by the chemicals. By the 1990s, it was clear that the tragedy had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Environmental poisoning. The land of Bhopal itself became a silent killer. When Union Carbide abandoned the factory after the disaster, it left behind not just broken machinery, but also tons of toxic waste. Pits filled with hazardous chemicals, leaking containers, and buried poisons remained on site, slowly contaminating the soil and groundwater. As the years passed, neighborhoods near the plant began reporting strange patterns, unusually high rates of cancer, birth defects, and chronic illness. Investigations revealed that wells and water sources used by local families were contaminated with dangerous chemicals. The people of Bhopal, already victims of one disaster, had become victims of another, an invisible, ongoing poisoning. Even today, many families living near the abandoned Union Carbide site drink water that is unsafe, simply because they have no alternative. The land, like the people, still bears the wounds of 1984. Struggles for justice and dignity. For survivors, daily life has been a struggle, not just for health, but also for dignity. Many of those affected were among the poorest in Bhopal, living in crowded neighborhoods and working in informal jobs. After the disaster, their ability to work was often destroyed. Breadwinners could not earn, children could not attend school, and families sank deeper into poverty. The compensation given through the 1989 settlement was quickly exhausted by medical bills. Survivors groups formed to demand better health care, more aid, and accountability from the government and corporations. Organizations such as the Bhopal Gas Pidit Mahila Udyog Sangathan and the Bhopal Group for Information and Action became powerful voices, keeping the issue alive in courts, newspapers, and international forums. Despite this, many survivors still feel forgotten. While the world moved on, they remained trapped in a daily cycle of illness, poverty, and unanswered questions. Bhopal as a global lesson. The Bhopal disaster forced the world to confront the dark side of industrialization. In its wake, many countries introduced stricter environmental and industrial safety laws. The idea of corporate social responsibility gained strength. International agreements began to emphasize the need for multinational companies to uphold safety standards everywhere, not just in rich nations. Yet, despite these changes, Bhopal remains a haunting reminder of what can happen when profit is placed above people. It demonstrates how vulnerable communities in developing nations often bear the highest risks of industrial growth, while powerful corporations shield themselves from accountability. Memory and activism. For survivors, memory itself has become a form of resistance. Every year, on the anniversary of the disaster, vigils are held in Bhopal. Families gather with photographs of loved ones, candles are lit, and slogans are chanted demanding justice. Murals and memorials across the city carry the faces of those lost, ensuring that the world does not forget. Activists from Bhopal have traveled worldwide, speaking at universities, conferences, and human rights forums, reminding audiences that the disaster is not history, it is ongoing. Their fight is not only for compensation, but also for recognition. Recognition that their suffering was not an accident, but the result of human choices, corporate greed, and governmental neglect. The unfinished story. Today, more than 4 decades after the disaster, Bhopal still waits for closure. The land around the Union Carbide plant remains toxic. Survivors still fill the wards of local clinics. Children are still born with defects linked to their parents' exposure. The Bhopal disaster is not simply a chapter in history, it is a living wound. And until justice is delivered, until the land is cleansed, and until survivors are given the care and dignity they deserve, the story of Bhopal cannot be called finished. Part 8. Global Impact and Lessons for the Future. The Bhopal gas tragedy was not just an Indian disaster, it was a global wake-up call. The poisonous cloud that descended on Bhopal in 1984 drifted across the conscience of the world, forcing nations, corporations, and ordinary citizens to confront questions about industrialization, human rights, and the true cost of progress. Industrial safety reimagined. Before Bhopal, many governments and corporations treated industrial accidents as isolated, unfortunate events. But the sheer scale of Bhopal, tens of thousands dead or disabled, made it impossible to ignore. International agencies began studying the tragedy in detail. Reports showed that the plant in Bhopal had ignored multiple warning signs: leaking pipes, malfunctioning safety systems, reduced staff, and the storage of massive amounts of dangerous chemicals without proper safeguards. In response, countries around the world introduced stricter industrial safety regulations. The European Union adopted new directives on the handling of hazardous substances, known as the Seveso directives, which were strengthened after Bhopal. The United States tightened its own chemical safety laws, requiring industries to share information with local communities about potential risks. India, shaken to its core, passed new legislation such as the Environment Protection Act of 1986, granting the government greater powers to regulate and close unsafe industries. The idea that safety cannot be optional became a central principle in industrial policy worldwide. Corporate responsibility and accountability. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Bhopal was that multinational corporations could no longer hide behind borders. For decades, powerful companies had relocated hazardous industries to poorer countries, where labor was cheaper, regulations weaker, and communities less able to resist. Bhopal exposed the dangers of this practice. It demonstrated that disasters in one corner of the world could damage a company's reputation globally. The pressure from international media, human rights groups, and activists forced corporations to rethink their responsibilities. Concepts like corporate social responsibility, CSR, environmental justice, and the precautionary principle gained strength after Bhopal. Activists argued that corporations must be held to the same safety standards everywhere, whether in New York, London, or Bhopal. And yet, the struggle continues. While laws improved, enforcement often remained weak. Survivors of Bhopal repeatedly pointed out that regulations on paper mean little unless they are backed by political will and corporate transparency. Human rights and environmental justice. The tragedy also reshaped global debates on human rights. It was no longer enough to talk about freedom of speech or political rights. Bhopal highlighted the right to breathe clean air, to drink safe water, and to live without the constant threat of industrial poisoning. Movements for environmental justice grew stronger, especially in the global south, where communities often live closest to factories, mines, and refineries. Bhopal became a rallying cry for campaigners demanding that poor and marginalized communities not be treated as expendable in the pursuit of profit. The survivors of Bhopal, many of them women from working-class neighborhoods, became powerful voices in this global struggle. Their protests, hunger strikes, and testimonies inspired movements against environmental racism, toxic dumping, and unsafe industrial practices around the world. The ethical lesson. Beyond laws and regulations, Bhopal delivered a moral question that still resonates. What is the value of human life in the age of industry? Union Carbide's settlement of $470 million was criticized as shockingly low compared to the scale of suffering. For many, it symbolized a world where corporations could weigh human lives in financial terms and walk away with little consequence. The lesson here is chilling but clear. Unless society demands accountability, profit will always outweigh people. Bhopal forces us to ask whether we are willing to accept such a world, or whether we will fight for one where human dignity comes first. A warning for the future. Today, more than 40 years later, new industrial zones rise across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The demand for pesticides, chemicals, and energy continues to grow. The same pressures that existed in Bhopal, cost-cutting, weak regulation, and corporate power, still exist, and in some places, they are even stronger. Bhopal is a warning. It tells us what happens when warnings are ignored, when governments fail to protect their people, and when corporations value profit more than human life. It is not just history. It is a message to the present and the future. The enduring legacy. In the end, the global impact of Bhopal cannot be measured only in laws or policies. It must be measured in the determination of survivors who refuse to be forgotten, in the voices of activists who carry their story across borders, and in the vigilance of communities who refuse to accept unsafe industries in their backyards. Bhopal is not just India's tragedy, it is the world's responsibility. Part 9, Conclusion. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, a silent poison swept across Bhopal. In a matter of hours, thousands of lives were extinguished, families torn apart, and a city transformed forever. But the tragedy did not end with the rising sun of December 3rd. It lived on, in hospitals crowded with the injured, in mass graves filled with the unnamed, and in the haunting silence of homes where laughter had vanished. Decades have passed. Children born long after that night still carry the scars in their bodies. Mothers still whisper the names of babies they lost. Fathers still remember the burning in their lungs. The factory stands abandoned, its rusting towers and leaking waste a monument to neglect, a constant reminder that Bhopal's wounds were never healed. The disaster was more than a failure of machinery. It was a failure of responsibility, of compassion, of justice. It revealed the danger of treating human beings as statistics, of allowing profit to overshadow protection, of allowing corporations to escape accountability. Yet amidst the suffering, there has also been resilience. Survivors have marched, protested, and spoken to the world. They have demanded to be seen not as victims, but as fighters. They have kept the memory alive so that the world cannot forget. Bhopal is not just a story of the past. It is a warning to the future. Around the globe, factories still rise near poor neighborhoods. Hazardous chemicals are still stored without safeguards. Workers are still asked to risk their lives in the name of progress. The same ingredients of disaster remain, waiting to ignite. The lesson of Bhopal is clear. Safety must never be sacrificed, human dignity must never be negotiated, and justice must never be delayed. When we remember Bhopal, we do more than honor the dead. We promise the living and the generations to come that their suffering will not be repeated. The city of Bhopal still breathes, scarred but unbroken. Its people endure, carrying the weight of history in their lungs and in their hearts. And as long as they fight, the world is reminded of its duty. Because the true legacy of Bhopal is not just tragedy, it is a call to conscience. A call that asks, how many more Bhopals will it take before humanity learns